thanks to Judy, and let me add to the Center of Faith and Vocations welcome, our own welcome from the Department of Religion here at Butler University. As most of you know, this is the third in our series of seminars on religion, peacemaking, and conflict. And as always, we will run a tight ship. I will play the role of time minder and time miser. But my parsimony has a point, which is to preserve as much of that second hour for conversation as we can absolutely preserve. Our keynote speaker, Professor William Cavanaugh, will speak for 35 to 40 minutes, and then each of our respondents will take about 10 minutes. And I'll start shuffling and grumbling a few minutes before each of them runs out of time. So our keynote speaker tonight is Dr. William Cavanaugh, who is a research professor at the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University in Chicago. He received his PhD from Duke University, an MA from Cambridge, and a BA from Notre Dame. His research focuses on systematic theology and social ethics, and religious violence, or the myth thereof, has been a central concern of his for many years. Author of numerous publications and a frequent public speaker, his most recent book is called The Myth of Religious Violence, Secular Ideology and the Roots of Modern Conflict, which came out from Oxford University Press in 2009. And in conversations, actually, since I wrote this, I've discovered that he's got 2 or 3 more books in the pipeline as well, so soon, more soon to come. He received the University Scholars Grant from the University of St. Thomas, where he worked until this year. He was a visiting fellow at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the University of Notre Dame in 2001, and he received a Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation Dissertation Fellowship in 1994. So we're looking forward to hearing from him this evening, and please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Well, thanks, Chad, for that kind introduction, and thanks to everybody here, to Judy and Marguerite and everybody who's made me feel welcome over the last few hours. It seems like there's a lot of good things going on here at the Butler campus, some things that don't have to do with basketball. I want to let you know, by the way, that even though my PhD is from Duke, I was rooting hard for Butler in the final last year, so yeah. When I recently gave a lecture entitled, "Does Religion Cause Violence?" at a college out east, I was on my way to the lecture hall and I saw a poster for the lecture, and someone had scrawled a single word across it, "Duh." And that says a lot about the status of the idea that religion causes violence. It's kind of a truism in our society. It's part of the conventional wisdom of Western societies, and it underlies a lot of our institutions and policies, from limits on the public role of churches to efforts to promote secularism in the Middle East and so on. But tonight I'm going to challenge that conventional wisdom, but not in the ways that it's usually challenged by people who identify themselves as religious. Such people will sometimes argue that the real motivation behind so-called religious violence is in fact economic and political and not religious. The crusader is, or other people will argue that people who do violence by definition are not religious, so the crusader is not really a Christian because he doesn't understand the meaning of Christianity and so on. I don't think that either of these two arguments works. In the first place, I don't think it's possible to separate out religious and political from economic and political from religious motives. In a lot of forms of Islam, for example, people make no such sharp distinction between politics and religion. In the second place, it may be the case that the crusader has misappropriated the true message of Christ, but I don't think you can therefore just excuse Christianity of all responsibility. Christianity is not primarily a set of doctrines, but a lived historical experience, and I have no intention of excusing Christianity or Islam or any other system from violence that can and is done in their name. Given certain conditions, they can and do contribute to violence. But what's implied in the conventional wisdom is that Christianity, Islam, and so on are more inclined towards violence than ideologies and institutions that are labeled secular. And it's that story that I want to challenge tonight. I'll argue that there is no good reason for thinking that religious ideologies and institutions are more inherently prone to violence than so-called secular ideologies and institutions. And furthermore, that this is so because there is no essential difference between religious and secular to begin with. These are invented categories, not simply the way things are. And so I will look at the political reasons why these categories were invented in the modern West. I will then show that the idea that something called religion is essentially prone to violence is an ideological justification that can be used to justify the violence of so-called secular orders. So the myth of religious violence promotes a dichotomy between us in the secular West who are rational and peacemaking, and them, the hordes of violent religious fanatics over there somewhere. These days, we tend to think in terms of the Muslim world. So their violence is religious and therefore irrational and divisive. Our violence, on the other hand, is secular and rational and peacemaking, and so sometimes we regrettably are forced to find ourselves bombing them into the higher rationality. Right? So, I'm going to start with the incoherence of the argument. One of the most famous atheists today, Christopher Hitchens, he has a book, bestseller called God is Not Great, and it's subtitled with typical British understatement, How Religion Poisons Everything. And there he points to histories of abuses by Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Confucianists, and so on. But he also faces up to the fact that rigidly atheist regimes, like those of Joseph Stalin and Kim Jong-il, are responsible for tens of millions of deaths and uncounted suffering. Hitchens deals with this little problem by declaring that atheist regimes like Stalin's are religious too. Totalitarianism aims at human perfection, which is essentially a religious impulse, according to Hitchens. So religion poisons everything because everything poisonous gets identified as religion. At the same time, everything good ends up on the other side of the religious-secular divide. So Hitchens says of Martin Luther King Jr., quote, in no real as opposed to nominal sense was he a Christian. Now, Hitchens bases this remarkable conclusion on the notion that King was nonviolent while the Bible preaches violence from cover to cover. So what is not violent cannot possibly be religious because religion is defined as violent. Now, at this point, we could dismiss Hitchens and assume that Stalin is not really religious and start arguing who has caused more deaths in the 20th century, atheists or those who believe in God or gods. But that would be to assume, I think, that we really know what religion is and what religion isn't. Hitchens is useful because he shows that what counts as religion and what doesn't is very fluid and often depends on the political agenda one is pursuing. And Hitchens is by no means alone in this. If you examine arguments that religion causes violence, you find that what counts as religion and what does not is completely incoherent. And so let me give you a few examples of this. The preeminent historian Martin Marty, in a book on public religion, Marty argues that religion has a particular tendency to be divisive and therefore violent. But Marty lists 17 different definitions of religion, and then he begs off giving his own definition since he says, quote, scholars will never agree on a definition of religion. And then he goes on to give what he calls 5 features that mark a religion. So I'm not going to give a definition, but I'll give you 5 features that mark a religion. And then he goes on to show how politics fits all 5 of the same features. Religion focuses our ultimate concern, and so does politics. Religion builds community, and so does politics. Religion appeals to myth and symbol, and politics does too, in devotion to the flag and war memorials and so on. So Marty offers 5 defining features of religion and shows how politics fits all 5. He's trying to show how closely intertwined religion and politics are, but he ends up demolishing any theoretical basis for separating the two. Let me give you another example. Sociologist Mark Juergensmeyer, whose book Terror in the Mind of God is perhaps the most widely influential academic book on religion and violence, According to Juergensmeyer, religion exacerbates the tendency to divide people into friends and enemies, good and evil, us and them, by ratcheting divisions up to a cosmic level. But then he's forced to admit the difficulty of separating religious violence from secular violence. In his book, The New Cold War, he writes, quote, "Secular nationalism, like religion, embraces what one scholar calls a doctrine of destiny. One can take this way of looking at secular nationalism a step further and state flatly that secular nationalism is a religion," end quote. Now, that's an important concession. If it's true, however, it undermines the entire basis of his life's work, which is the sharp divide between religious and secular violence, right? If secular nationalism is a religion, then the distinction has crumbled into a heap of contradictions. Now, for some religion and violence theorists, the confusion around this religious-secular divide is resolved by openly expanding the definition of religion to include ideologies and practices that are usually called secular. So one example of this is a book by Richard Wentz called Why People Do Bad Things in the Name of Religion. And in that book, he blames violence on absolutism, and he says religion has a peculiar tendency towards absolutism. But when it comes to saying what religion is, he includes the following things as religions: faith in technology, secular humanism, consumerism, football fanaticism, and a host of other worldviews. He has this wonderful thing where he describes a guy watching this kind of non-church-going auto mechanic who sits down on Monday night to watch football, and he describes him as kind of letting his belly pop open his fly, and he arranges his sandwiches and beer just so, and he describes this as in kind of Eucharistic overtones as being this kind of religion. And so Wentz is compelled to conclude, rather lamely, quote, "Perhaps all of us do bad things in the name of religion." Well, I think he should be commended for his consistency in not trying to erect an artificial distinction between religious and secular types of absolutism. The price of consistency, however, is that he evacuates his own argument of any sort of explanatory force or usefulness. So the word religion in the title of his book, Why People Do Bad Things in the Name of Religion, ends up meaning anything people do that gives their lives order and meaning. So a more economical title for the book would have just been Why People Do Bad Things, right? The term religion doesn't serve any useful purpose. Now, Wentz and Hitchens and Juergensmeyer, I can go on and on, by the way, and I do in my book. Some reviewers have said, cried uncle, and just said, I mean, one of the things I've done in the book is just repeat example after example. Now, these figures that I've cited so far are not necessarily wrong to include so-called secular things in the category religion. And in fact, there's a vast literature on this. Marxism as a religion, for example. There's an extensive body of scholarship that explores the prevalence of civil religion in the United States, which, as Robert Bellah says, quote, has its own seriousness and integrity and requires the same care and understanding that any other religion does, end quote. So for Bellah, religion is not privatized in the US. Traditional faiths like Christianity and Judaism are privatized, but the religion of nationalism occupies the public realm. And Carolyn Marvin similarly argues that, quote, nationalism is the most powerful religion in the United States and perhaps in many other countries, end quote. Scholars have explored the peculiar myths and symbols and sacrifices that surround the flag. In the wake of rolling blackouts in 2001 in California, one of the architects of the deregulation of California's electrical utilities was quoted in the New York Times expressing his belief that free markets always work better than state control, and he said, quote, "I believe in that premise as a matter of religious faith," end quote. And many scholars just take him at his word, right? A survey of religious studies literature finds the following treated under the rubric religion: totems, witchcraft, human rights, Marxism, liberalism, Freudianism, Japanese tea ceremonies, nationalism, sports fanaticism, free market ideology, Alcoholics Anonymous, and a host of other institutions and practices. Alcoholics Anonymous was declared a religion by a federal judge in 2002. Now, there's a big scholarly trajectory that expands this definition of religion. That's the point. Now, some will object and say, no, religion is about God or gods, right? But if you take that tack, then you would have to eliminate certain things that are usually called religions, like Taoism or Confucianism or many types of Buddhism, which don't have a central concept of God or gods. So, but if you don't want, if the definition of religion is expanded to include Taoism and Confucianism and all types of Buddhism, then you end up including many other things that are usually labeled secular. Many institutions and ideologies that don't explicitly refer to God or gods function in the same way as those that do. Okay, that's the point. Now, this is particularly relevant to the question of violence. Is there any good reason to suppose that people are more likely to kill for a god than for a nation? Well, supposing we ask two more specific, provocative questions. What percentage of Americans who identify themselves as Christians would be willing to kill for Jesus or kill for their Christian faith? And then ask what percentage would be willing to kill for their country? It seems clear that at least among American Christians, the nation state is subject to far more absolutist fervor than Christianity. For the majority of American Christians, even public evangelization is considered to be in poor taste, and yet most endorse organized slaughter on behalf of the nation as sometimes necessary and often laudable. So I think we have to conclude that there is no coherent way to isolate religious ideologies with a peculiar tendency towards violence from their tamer secular counterparts. So-called secular ideologies and institutions like nationalism and capitalism can inspire just as much violence as so-called religion. The problem with Hitchens, then, is not just that he thinks Stalinism is a religion. The problem is that if he's going to use this expansive definition of religion, he should do so consistently, but he doesn't. For Hitchens, American civil religion is not religion. It's secular. The secular religious distinction is really, it really ends up being nothing more than the distinction between the things Hitchens likes and the things Hitchens doesn't like, all right? Now, please note that what I'm not saying is that the problem with religion is that it has some fuzzy edges on it. Every concept has fuzzy edges, right? Politics and culture, those kind of things they always have some fuzzy edges, but they're useful concepts nevertheless. The problem with the religion and violence arguments is not that their implicit definition of religion is too fuzzy. The problem is that it's unjustifiably clear what does and doesn't qualify as a religion. So certain belief systems, like Islam, are condemned while certain others, like nationalism, are ignored. So my point here is not to argue either for or against this expansive definition of religion. I have no intention of trying to solve once and for all, for example, whether or not Confucianism is a religion or Marxism is a religion or free market capitalism is a religion and so on. I don't think there is a once and for all definition of religion. My point is rather that religion is a category which is constructed in different ways, in different times and places, according to the interests of who is doing the construction. So to understand why there's so much confusion around the category of religion, we need to examine its history. And that's what I'm going to go and do in the second part of the paper then, the history of religion. The students in the seminar read the second chapter of my book where I do an extensive history, which I'm going to condense into a very small space of the history of religion. The basic problem with the idea that religion causes violence is the category of religion. What do you mean by that? The scholars that I've been discussing assume that religion is a trans-historical and trans-cultural human activity that's essentially different from secular phenomena. Transhistorical meaning all found in all times, transcultural meaning found in all places, right? In reality, though, the religious-secular distinction is a relatively recent Western creation, and what counts as religion and what counts as secular in any given context is determined by certain political configurations of power. So Charles Kimball's book, When Religion Becomes Evil, begins with the following claim. It is somewhat trite, but nevertheless sadly true, to say that more wars have been waged, more people killed, and these days more evil perpetrated in the name of religion than by any other institutional force in human history. Now, Kimball apparently considers this claim too trite to need proving because he doesn't offer any evidence for it. But if you were to try to offer evidence for it, you would need a transhistorical and transcultural concept of religion that would be at least theoretically separable from other institutional forces over the course of history. So an obvious contender would be politics, right? You'd have to be able to separate religion from politics. The problem is that there was no religion considered as something separable from politics until the modern era, and then primarily in the West. So what sense could be made of separating out Roman politics from Roman religion when the Caesars were gods, right? You know, in the Aztecs' bloody human sacrifices, are they religious or are they political? Well, it's a nonsensical question because there simply isn't those kinds of distinctions that are made at the time. So Wilfred Cantwell Smith's landmark book, The Meaning and End of Religion, he showed that religion is a discrete category of human activity separable from culture, politics, and other areas of life is an invention of the modern West. So in the course of a detailed historical study of the concept religion, Smith concluded that in pre-modern Europe there was no significant concept equivalent to what we think of as religion. So the ancient Romans, for example, employed the term religio. That's where the term comes from. But it covered all kinds of civic duties and relations of respect that we would consider secular. Here's what St. Augustine says about religio and the city of God. Quote, "We have no right to affirm with confidence that religio is confined to the worship of God, since it seems that this word has been detached from its normal meaning, in which it refers to an attitude of respect in relations between a man and his neighbor." So that, according to Augustine, is what religio meant in the ancient world, an attitude of respect in relations between a man and his neighbor, something very different from what we mean now. In the medieval era, the religious-secular distinction was used exclusively to distinguish between clergy who belonged to orders and diocesan clergy. So that's why Catholics still today talk about entering an order as entering the religious life, right? So the religious-secular distinction meant something entirely different in the medieval era. There simply was no discrete activity called religion that was separable from politics or culture. The religious-secular distinction as we know it today was a creation of the early modern struggles for power between church and civil authorities. In the creation of the modern sovereign state between the 15th and 17th centuries, religion was invented as a universal, essentially interior and private impulse that is essentially separate from politics and other secular concerns. And what this does then is take the church's area of power and privatize it, right? The church's proper area of concern would be essentially alien from politics. The idea that religion is a transcultural and transhistorical impulse makes the separation of religion and politics appear natural and inevitable, and not a contingent arrangement of power in society, but it is a contingent arrangement. It's a very local thing that happens in Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries. And then it gets exported. It gets exported to the rest of the world in the process of colonization. So Smith's study concludes that, quote, "There is no closely equivalent concept to religion in any culture that has not been influenced by the modern West," end quote. He goes on to show that there was no such concept in ancient Greece, Egypt, China, India, anywhere else in the ancient world. In their initial encounters with the non-Western world, European explorers reported with remarkable consistency that the natives had no religion at all. And in the book, I give example case after case after case where the explorers come back from Australia or Africa and say the natives have no religion at all. Once they're colonized, however, the category religion becomes a powerful tool for the classification of native cultures as essentially distinct from the business of government, which is the business of the colonizers. Hinduism, for example. This is a term which is first used in 1829. You have Hindus before that, but you don't have Hinduism. Hinduism becomes labeled a religion in the course of the 19th century, despite the fact that Hinduism encompasses the entire Indian way of life, everything that we would include under culture, politics, religion, economy, all of that is Hinduism. It gets made into a religion. Fritz Stahl has concluded, quote, Hinduism does not merely fail to be a religion, it is not even a meaningful unit of discourse, end quote. That's not an insult to Hindus. What that means is that it's kind of like talking about Americanism. Right? What is that? You know, so you have a fundamentalist Baptist cowboy from Texas and an atheist computer programmer from New York City, and they're both adherents of Americanism. Well, it's just so vague that, you know, you can certainly find some things that they have in common. You know, they might both have 2 ears or something like that, but it's so vague as to be essentially meaningless. What is grouped under the label Hinduism and then labeled a religion is so diverse. But the classification proves extremely useful for the colonizers because, of course, under British rule, if Hinduism is a religion, then to be Indian is to be private and to be British is to be public. Right? And that's why many contemporary advocates of Hindu nationalism, the BJP party, for example, they reject the classification of Hinduism as a religion. As Richard Cohen writes, quote, the proponents of Hindu nationalism refuse to call Hinduism a religion precisely because they want to emphasize that Hinduism is more than mere internalized beliefs. It is social, political, economic, and familial in nature, end quote. And for similar reasons, Chinese nationalists in the 19th century denied that Confucianism and Taoism were religions. And for similar reasons, the Chinese government today excludes Confucianism from its official list of religions in China, even though Western scholars often call it a religion. It's seen as an expression of the national Chinese character, which is superior to religion, which is merely private and otherworldly, according to the Chinese government. That's the official document 19. So in her book, The Invention of World Religions, Tomoko Masusawa concludes, quote, this concept of religion as a general transcultural phenomenon, yet also as a distinct sphere in its own right, is patently groundless. It came from nowhere, and there is no credible way of demonstrating its factual and empirical substantiality, end quote. So in other words, the religious-secular distinction is not engraved in the nature of things. It is rather a distinction that is employed in Western or Westernized societies to marginalize certain kinds of beliefs and practices and to authorize others. So the last section of the paper, what I'm going to do then is show how it's used. If this distinction is so incoherent, why is it so prevalent? Why is this idea that religion causes violence so prevalent? And I'm going to show you a few uses, the way it's used in Western society. It's so prevalent because it's useful. So I'm going to give an example from domestic life, and then I'm going to talk about foreign policy, and then I'm going to end. In domestic life in the United States, the myth of religious violence has played a key role in shifting the dominant mode of jurisprudence from what Frederick Geddix calls religious communitarianism to secular individualism. Well into the 20th century, religion was cited in Supreme Court cases as having a unifying social effect. And then in 1940, for the first time, religion is cited in a Supreme Court case as a potentially dangerous and divisive social force. And that's the dominant discourse from 1940 on. The first such decision was Minersville School District versus Gobitis in 1940, which upheld compulsory pledging of allegiance to the American flag. Writing for the majority, Justice Felix Frankfurter invoked the specter of religious wars in denying the Jehovah's Witnesses the right to dissent from patriotic rituals. The Supreme Court ruled that you could be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance, even though it was against the Jehovah's Witnesses' beliefs. Quote, centuries of strife over the erection of particular dogmas as exclusive or all-comprehending faiths led to the inclusion of a guarantee for religious freedom in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment sought to guard against repetition of those bitter religious struggles by prohibiting the establishment of a state religion and by securing to every sect the free exercise of its faith, end quote. Now, you'd think that from that, they would have let the Jehovah's Witnesses not salute the flag. No, doesn't apply to the Jehovah's Witnesses in this case because their dissent threatened, quote, the promotion of national cohesion. We are dealing with an interest inferior to none in the hierarchy of legal values. National unity is the basis of national security. What the school authorities are really asserting is the right to awaken in the child's mind considerations as to the significance of the flag contrary to those implanted by the parent, end quote. And that was upheld. Now, 3 years later, the court would reverse itself, but Frankfurter had succeeded in introducing this idea that First Amendment decisions could be solved on the basis of the divisiveness and inherent violence of religion. And the antidote to that is nationalism, national unity. Martin Marty discusses this case in that book that I talked about, and he cites the many instances of Jehovah's Witnesses who were attacked, beaten, tarred, castrated, and imprisoned in the United States because they believed that followers of Jesus Christ could not salute a flag. Now, you would think that after telling that story, Martin Marty would draw the conclusion that zealous nationalism can sometimes cause violence. Astonishingly, Marty concludes, quote, it became obvious that religion, which can pose us versus them, carries risks and can be perceived by others as dangerous. Religion can cause all kinds of trouble in the public arena, end quote. Now, for Marty, religion refers not to the ritual vowing of allegiance to a flag, right? It used to be this was the gesture until Hitler made this unpopular, and then it became this. But religion, there's actually what I wanted for the cover of the book was a picture of school children giving the stiff arm salute to the American flag, but Oxford University Press thought that this would be a little bit too provocative. So anyway, censorship goes on. It's just a picture, right? I mean, and it's just the way it used to be, and then because of the Nazis, they changed it to this. But for Marty, what religion refers to here is not that. Religion is only the refusal to do that, right? So even though the Jehovah's Witnesses were the ones getting beat up and castrated and killed and so on, religion is provocative of violence and not nationalism, right? So the myth of religious violence is used to draw attention away from nationalist violence and towards so-called religious violence, even though in this case it was the Jehovah's Witnesses who suffered rather than perpetrated it. In the succeeding decades, then, the myth of religious violence would be invoked by the Supreme Court in case after case, in decisions banning school prayer, forbidding voluntary religious instruction on public school property, forbidding state aid to parochial school teachers, and so on, case after case after case. When the Supreme Court banned school prayer in the Abington case in 1963, again invoking the specter of religious violence, Justice Potter Stewart dissented, warning of, quote, the establishment of a religion of secularism. Interesting quote. And Stewart noted the long history of government religious practice in the U.S., including the fact that the Supreme Court opened its sessions with God save this honorable court, right? But in their concurring opinion, upholding the decision, Justices Goldberg and Harlan addressed this objection by drawing a sharp line between patriotic invocations of God and religious ones. So here's the quote. There is, of course, nothing in the decision reached here that is inconsistent with the fact that school children and others are officially encouraged to express love for our country by reciting historical documents such as the Declaration of Independence, which contain references to the deity. Such patriotic or ceremonial occasions bear no true resemblance to the unquestioned religious exercise that the state has sponsored in this instance. End quote. Now, they offer no reason why patriotic invocations of God bear no true resemblance to religious invocations. But it's clear that what separates religion from what's not religion is not the invocation of God, right? God can be invoked in public ceremonies without such ceremonies thereby becoming religious exercises, as long as those ceremonies express love for our country, right? So separating religion from non-religion in the Supreme Court's eyes depends not on the presence or absence of expressions of faith in God, but on the presence or absence of expressions of faith in the United States of America, right? So American nationalism is the antidote for religious divisiveness, and more specifically, revulsion to killing and dying in the name of one's religion is one of the principal means by which we become convinced that killing and dying in the name of the nation is laudable and proper. So there's one example from domestic, or many examples, I suppose, from domestic politics. Now I'm going to give some examples from foreign policy of how the myth of religious violence is used. It justifies and reinforces Western attitudes and policies towards the non-Western world, especially Muslims these days, whose primary point of difference with the West is said to be their stubborn refusal to tame religious passions in the public sphere. Hitchens, for example, skewers religion for its violence, but he has been an enthusiastic supporter of the Iraq War and in general Western military adventures in the Muslim world. And despite his attempt to recruit Martin Luther King to his side, Hitchens has some very approving things to say about killing people. Quote, "And I say to the Christians while I'm at it, go love your own enemies. By the way, don't be loving mine. I think the enemies of civilization should be beaten and killed and defeated, and I don't make any apology for it." That's Hitchens. For Hitchens, the Iraq War is part of a broader war for secularism, and the game is zero-sum. Quote, Hitchens again, "It's not possible for me to say, well, you pursue your Shiite dream of a hidden imam, and I pursue my study of Thomas Paine and George Orwell, and the world is big enough for both of us. The true believer cannot rest until the whole world bows the knee." And of course, what he's thinking is the true believer in this case is the militant Islamist. But Hitchens' message, of course, is that the true believer in secularism cannot rest until the whole world has been converted to secularism by force if necessary. Fellow atheist Sam Harris's book about the violence and irrationality of religion dramatically illustrates this same double standard. In The End of Faith, Harris condemns the irrational religious torture of witches, but provides his own argument for torturing terrorists. Harris's book is charged with the conviction that the secular West cannot reason with religious people, but must deal with them by force. Here's a quote from Harris. "Some propositions are so dangerous that it may even be ethical to kill people for believing them. Certain beliefs place their adherents beyond the reach of every peaceful means of persuasion while inspiring them to commit acts of extraordinary violence against others. There is, in fact, no talking to some people. If they cannot be captured, and often they cannot, otherwise tolerant people may be justified in killing them. This is what the United States attempted in Afghanistan, and it is what we and other Western powers are bound to attempt at even greater cost to ourselves and innocents abroad, elsewhere in the Muslim world. We will continue to spill blood in what is, at bottom, a war of ideas." Now his logic, end quote, his logic, of course, is impeccable. If religious people are so irrational that they will do violence on behalf of these beliefs, there's no use trying to reason with them, and they can only be dealt with by force. So the myth of religious violence becomes a justification for the use of violence. In a chapter entitled "The Problem with Islam," Harris writes, In our dialogue with the Muslim world, we are confronted by people who hold beliefs for which there is no rational justification and which cannot, therefore, even be discussed. And yet these are the very beliefs that underlie many of the demands they are likely to make upon us, end quote. And this is especially a problem, he says, if such people gain access to nuclear weapons. Quote, there is little possibility of our having a Cold War with an Islamist regime armed with long-range nuclear weapons. In such a situation, the only thing likely to ensure our survival may be a nuclear first strike of our own. Needless to say, this would be an unthinkable crime, as it would kill tens of millions of innocent civilians in a single day, but it may be the only course of action available to us given what Islamists believe, end quote. He goes on to say that Muslims would likely misinterpret this act of self-defense as a genocidal crusade, thus plunging the world into nuclear holocaust. Quote, again, all of this is perfectly insane, of course. I have just described a plausible scenario in which much of the world's population could be annihilated on account of religious ideas that belong on the same shelf with Batman, the Philosopher's Stone, and unicorns, end quote. So in other words, if we have to slaughter millions of people through a nuclear first strike, it will be the fault of them and their crazy religious beliefs. Before we get to that point, Harris continues, we must encourage civil society in Islamic countries, but we cannot trust them to vote it in. Quote, it seems all but certain that some form of benign dictatorship will generally be necessary to bridge the gap, but benignity is the key, and if it cannot emerge from within a state, it must be imposed from without. The means of such imposition are necessarily crude, economic isolation, military intervention, or some combination of both. While this may seem an exceedingly arrogant doctrine to espouse, it appears we have no alternatives. I've just got one page left. So, conclusion. Now, this is a particularly blunt version of this argument, but he's by no means isolated. This book, by the way, won the 2005 Penn Award for nonfiction. And it's enthusiastically endorsed by such academic superstars as Alan Dershowitz, Richard Dawkins, and Peter Singer. This is the same Peter Singer who doesn't think it's justifiable to eat animals for food, to kill animals for food, but apparently killing other irrational humans is okie dokie. Harris's logic is really little different in practice from the Bush doctrine that America has access to liberal values that are right and true for every person in every society. We must use our power to promote such values on every continent, and that America will take preemptive action if necessary to promote such values, right? The point being, again, that the myth of religious violence can be used to justify secularist violence. Now, I don't wish at all to excuse the vices of other social orders or to ignore the virtues of our own social order, our own liberal social order. What I want to do is challenge instead this religious-secular dichotomy that causes us to turn a blind eye to secular, so-called secular forms of violence. Insofar as the myth of religious violence creates the villains against which a liberal social order defines itself, the myth is really little different than previous forms of imperialism, which talked about the inferiority of those people over there. So what I'm trying to do is level the playing field. Yes, let's look at jihad. Let's look at the sacrificial atonement of Christ and how those things can promote violence under certain circumstances, but let's also look at the invisible hand of the market. Let's look at the America as worldwide liberator as also being ideologies that can promote violence under certain circumstances. So a leveling of the playing field. Leveling the playing field doesn't mean that the game's going to end in a tie, right? It just means that you call fouls on both sides equally. Violence feeds on the need for enemies, the need to separate us versus them. These binary ways of dividing the world make the world understandable for us, but they also make the world unlivable for many. So doing away with the myth of religious violence is one way of resisting such binaries and perhaps turning some enemies into friends. Thank you.
Thank you to Professor Cavanaugh. Our first respondent is Dr. Margaretha Geertsema. Dr. Geertsema received a PhD in journalism from the University of Texas at Austin after receiving a master's degree from Washington State University and a bachelor's degree from Northwest University in her home country, South Africa. Her research focuses on the participation in and representation of women in international news, and she often teaches about media portrayals of violence. Her work has been published in a number of prestigious journals, including Journalism and Mass Communication Quarterly, Feminist Media Studies, and others. Just last year, Dr. Geertsema was given the Outstanding Faculty Award in Social Sciences by Butler's own College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Butler isn't alone in its high estimation of her abilities. In 2008, the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication granted her the Mary Ann Yodelis Smith Award for Feminist Scholarship. So we look forward to her response to Professor Cavanaugh's presentation. And let's welcome her as well.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Dr. Cavanaugh for his stimulating presentation. Also, thank you for Dr. Bowman for the invitation to be a discussant. I would like to make a few comments tonight here based on Dr. Cavanaugh's talk. He talked tonight about the myth of religious violence. Coincidentally, just this past week, students in my international communication class watched a film in which renowned scholar Edward Said discussed the myth of the clash of civilizations. I was wondering if you drew upon that title. I think these two myths actually have much in common. They both give us a common enemy, something to unite against. They also both perpetuate the Western sense of superiority over the backward, non-Western world. I would like to make three comments. First, a focus on so-called religious violence is creating a divided world of us and them, of the West and the rest, as Samuel Huntington stated in his work on the clash of civilizations. We know from Edward Said's work on Orientalism that it is impossible to group together diverse regions of the world into a reductive West and the rest, because cultures are not monolithic. As we just heard in his talk, we can't even think about an Americanism, what that would look like. Not only are cultures not monolithic, they are not static, they are not fixed. Cultures also are not isolated, especially as we see an increasing interconnectedness through globalization. Just the same then, we cannot use these broad brushstrokes to condemn certain religions as violent or oppressive. Those of you who attended the presentation last year by Reza Aslan might perhaps remember that he explained how Islam is different from place to place and from time to time. I see a few heads going up and down, good. He even talked about a specific American version of Islam that exists. Religion then is not static, it is not fixed, it is not the same for everyone. Religions are not monolithic. This refutes the idea of religious violence. My second point, I agree that religion can seldom be separated from secular. As you heard in the introduction, I was born and raised in South Africa. And what better example do we have of the partnership of religion and nationalism as the apartheid government that stood for a Christian nationalist society? We all know where that took us. Was the violence against people of color in South Africa religious, or was it nationalist? It is seldom seen as religious violence, perhaps because the dominant religion was Christianity and not Islam. Right? Okay. For a moment I got nervous there. Not only is religion inseparable from nationalism, I think religion, culture, and tradition are often grouped together in efforts to legitimize the violation of women's rights through violence, particularly in the private sphere. Just consider the so-called honor killings, female genital cutting, dowry deaths, child brides. Oftentimes these violations are unrelated to religion and more closely tied to culture, tradition, or patriarchy. Yet religion, and again specifically Islam, often becomes the scapegoat. The last point I would like to make is more from my own area of study in media studies. Most of what we know about world conflicts we learn through the news media. Very few of us have the opportunity to be in the middle of these conflicts, fortunately. We have to ask ourselves then, what is the role of the media in portraying these conflicts? Some people think the news media is simply a mirror and that it reflects to us that which exists and that it is an accurate reflection. However, we know today that that is not possible. Instead of a mirror, the news media are much more a window on the world. This window frames events in a specific manner due to various external factors in the news production process. These factors can vary from tight deadlines to editorial policies, to political pressure, and to societal ideologies. In fact, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman argued in their propaganda model in the 80s that the news media serve the interests of the political and economic elite, who for some reason may want to promote the idea of clashing civilizations or religious conflicts. So we have to understand that the news media at best provides a frame, and most often a reductive frame, of religious violence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Geertsema. I can assure you those were moans of agreement, not moans of dissent. Our final speaker is Dr. Lawrence Gerstein. Dr. Gerstein is a professor of psychology and director of doctoral training in counseling psychology at Ball State University. He also directs the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies there. He's published over 75 scholarly articles, book chapters, and books, and was for some time editor of the Journal of Mental Health Counseling. In 1991, Professor Gerstein was honored with the Carl D. Perkins Government Relations Award from the American Association of Counseling and Development, while in 1999 he was given the Kitty Cole Human Rights Award from the American Counseling Association. And in 2006, he was selected to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award from the College of Education of the University of Georgia, where he earned master's and doctoral degrees. Professor Gerstein became involved in the Tibet movement in the 1980s when Tuxter Rinpoche, His Holiness the Dalai Lama's oldest brother, requested his help. Initially, Gerstein was the director of the Indiana Tibet Committee, and in 1995, he co-founded the International Tibet Independence Movement with Rinpoche. Since 1995, he's served as its president. So we are looking forward also to his unique perspective on tonight's theme, and please join me in welcoming him as well.
Thank you, Dr. Baumann, and good evening, everybody. Thank you, Judy Sabula, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I've got to kind of qualify my remarks by saying that you probably have figured out already that I'm not an expert scholar in religious studies or in philosophy. So it's a bit difficult for me to even grasp the complexity of Professor Cavanaugh's remarks tonight. I hope I could give justice to his comments and something that might contribute to the conversation so far. Both Dr. Cavanaugh and Margaretha talked about the fact that it was impossible to separate religion from other aspects of our life, including culture and political system and the economic system. Yet that's what I heard being done, taking religion and isolating it as a variable. From a Buddhist perspective, that's illogical, because in Buddhism the belief is that everything is interdependent, and to try to explain one piece is to miss the whole of the picture. So the question becomes, what is this myth? Is it a myth of religion and violence, or is it a myth that's a mystery that we cannot sort out? Now, I would suggest that it's a mystery that it's impossible to sort out, and that we can attempt to utter an explanation, but the fact is that perception oftentimes is more important than what is actually a reality. So some of us might believe very strongly that religion is a major contributor to the violence that we've seen in our society for thousands of years. And as much as scholars and other folks want to convince us otherwise, it'll be impossible for us to get to a point where we believe otherwise. So I think somehow in our cultural upbringing, in our society, particularly in the Western world, we've been conditioned to believe that religion is a prominent contributor to the emergence of violence. But again, from a Buddhist point of view, if you do believe in karma, then we all have to take responsibility for the evolution of violence in our society over the course of time. Most teachers, Buddhist teachers that have come here to the West, have taught us about something called karma, individual karma. They've taught you about cause and effect, your own personal behavior. But in reality, in Buddhism, there's another kind of karma, which is much more important, and that's community karma. And community karma represents the threads that bind us all together. And it's our community karma from a Buddhist point of view that results in all of the cause and effect and current circumstances that we find ourselves in. So to talk about religion, to talk about politics, to talk about economics, as us being unconnected to those constructs is not correct from a Buddhist point of view. Bottom line of this kind of argument is that we're all responsible for the violence that has occurred, regardless of how you explain it. And at the same time, we're all responsible for promoting nonviolence. And I find it very interesting, at least in psychology, which is my expertise, that we've devoted a lot of resources to understanding violence and aggression, but we know very little about nonviolence. And I wonder what would happen if people in my profession and perhaps other professions like Dr. Cavanaugh would spend more of their scholarly time devoted to investigating what are the roots of nonviolence and what are the nonviolent policies and actions that different religions have taken over the course of time to promote a civil society rather than a decisive society. One I guess, request of Dr. Cavanaugh is maybe to write another book on the myth of nonviolence and religion. Because, you know, we all know, we've all heard, and those of us who have some exposure to the traditions, the religious traditions around the world, that the basic premise and philosophy and values of our religions are the same. Yet we find it very difficult to enact those basic philosophies and principles and strategies. And I think in part it's because at this point in time the media and other forces are pushing us to focus on the other side of our existence, which is regression and tension. Last thing I want to pose is a strange idea that I've had for many, many years that would be amazing if it came to fruition. I kind of wonder what it would take for the world religious leaders to sit down and establish an agreement that for the next 25, 50 years, they were going to preach and promote a message of nonviolence to their congregants and to let their flock know that for the next 25, 50 years, we're gonna focus on getting along and what's similar about us rather than different. I think it would be an interesting social experiment. I'm not sure that it would be successful, but just kind of imagine for a moment if someone like the Pope and His Holiness the Dalai Lama and a strong religious leader of the Protestant and Baptist community and Muslim community and Jewish community sat down and put this message out to the world as a request to see if we can, for 25, 50 years, as a challenge, get along with each other. Thanks so much.